Oh dear. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. Shit is about to get real. If you haven't seen the animation yet, these 10 seconds should probably get the point across.
I'm charging up to the max. And then charging up even more!
Yeah, there's a lot of speculation going around. Some people are suggesting that we're getting another button added into the game. I don't think that's the case. When I, and many others, saw this trailer, I instantly thought of overcharging supers. Right now, our super bar stops at 100%. You charge the bar until it's full, and then you use your super. It's pretty straightforward. Overcharging, or to be on brand here, hypercharging, would let you charge your super above 100%. Maybe you unlock your hyper at 200 or even 300%. This would give you a stronger yet similar ability to the original super. This concept has been used in other games, but it would be so insane in Brawl Stars. Who do I think is gonna get hypers? I'm gonna be real. I'm getting flashbacks to second star powers right now, and I feel that every brawler is gonna get a hyper. This makes me extremely excited, but also insanely worried. Balancing has never been perfect in Brawl, and hypers, they definitely have the potential to define the meta in a very toxic way. It happened back when gadgets first came out, but they're a little bit more balanced these days. It also happened with gears. And even then, Speed Gear 1000% changed the way we play around bushes, and I'm still not sure if it was for the better. The reality is, we're stuck with Speed Gears and could be stuck with meta-defining hypers in the near future. And I'm not saying I'm against hypers, but I really, and I mean I really hope that the dev team had the best fucking chefs in the kitchen when cooking this one up. I can see hypers being so good and so fun for the game, but at the same time, I can also see them being absolutely terrible and unfun, destroying this game that we've all fallen in love with. Speaking of terrible, here's some ideas for every brawler's hyper that I came up with. In my head, most hypers will be a busted version of the brawler super. They'll probably be really flashy too. I imagine them having purple effects like in the teaser video. Shelly Hyper gets a huge conical range and activates a damage boost on use. You know how when you first showed up against a Shelly as a noob and it just jump scared the shit out of you? Imagine that, but like cinematic. Colt's Hyper range gets extended and he dishes out even more bullets that are thicker than usual. Bull Hyper is faster and stronger. It pushes enemies to the end of his super like Colette's Push It star power and gives multiple lasting buffs to Bull. Brock fires out even more rockets faster, and they leave incendiary puddles. Barley's Hyper throws a wild super with more bottles and more damage. Nita's Bear is bigger and faster, with a slightly longer attack range. Primo Hyper Jump becomes more intense and tosses enemies up on contact. Poco Hyper heals allies to full HP and applies a temporary damage buff. Rosa's shield percent and duration increases, alongside giving her a speed buff. Rico Hyper super fires more bullets at a faster rate. Jessie Hyper increases Scrappy's range, firing rate, and HP. It also heals over time. Dynamite throws 3 purple barrels of boom. Daryl Roll gets more range and a faster speed. Penny Hyper Turret fires in a triplet pattern. Tick Headfirst has a longer deploy range and a stronger explosion. Carl Hyper Super can't be knocked out by stuns or other crowd control. 8-Bit Hyper also increases reload speed of members in the turret. Jackie Hyper increases pull radius and gives a damage reduction shield again to Jackie. Gus Hyper increases overshield health and adds a reload buff to the recipient of the shield. Bo turns up the heat and makes his basic arrows explosive with fire damage for 20 seconds. Piper Hyper reloads all ammo and HP upon use while jumping. It also increases her damage for a bit upon landing. Pam Hyper has 2 parts, a ground turret and a moving station strapped onto her back. Frank Hyper increases the range and stun duration. BB Hyper shoots out 3 bubbles in succession. B Hyper does her regular super but then lets her shoot through walls for 5 seconds. Gale Hyper is wider with more pushing power and damage. Nanny Hyper increases Peep's radius and damage. It allows the user to instantly detonate Peep while in motion. Surge Hyper Jump does more damage and gives an extreme tier up if used at the current max tier. Colette Hyper breaks walls and deals more damage. Edgar Hyper has longer jump range and a faster speed buff upon landing. Stu Hyper adds knockback back to his super. Grom Hyper is basically a nuke. Griff Hyper gets multiple super salvos. Bonnie Hyper does knockback and extra damage upon landing. Hank Hyper would make his missiles seek and deal fire damage to enemies. Mortis Hyper is longer, wider, and does more damage with a huge swarm of bats. Tara Hyper has a greater pull radius and then dims the screen a little bit. Gene Hyper could increase the range and width of the pull and boost reload for a few seconds. Mr. P overclocks his porter station, letting him have 2 porters on the ground at all times. Max Hyper increases speed percent and gives reload buffs as well to allies. Sprout Hyper makes temporary indestructible walls. Byron Hyper radius increases with more damage / heals depending on its use case. Squeak Hyper is more damaging with 12 blobs of splat instead of 6. Gray Hyper increases his teleport range and gives Gray a damage reduction shield upon use. Willow Hyper increases the width of her super and lets it go through walls. Controlled brawlers will also deal more damage. Doug Hyper makes the hot dog recipient spawn with reload and damage buff. Spike's Hyper has a larger radius and gives Spike a damage reduction shield while in the radius. Crow Hyper gives Crow Jump more range with extra volleys of daggers upon jumping. Leon Hyper lets Leon go through walls while invisible. Sandy's Hyper Sandstorm gets even larger, covering nearly the entire map. Amber Hyper blows a firestorm, instantly burning opponents who get hit. Meg Hyper gets inspiration from Surge, upgrading her mech for 20 seconds. Chester Hyper makes all of his possible supers ridiculously large in size. If he gets the heal one, perhaps just make it do a metric fuck ton of healing. Lou Hyper makes a blizzard, where all opponents on the map slowly build up the freeze status. Ruff's Hyper gives the treat recipient more efficient supercharging. Bell Hyper adds constant visibility and slower reload to the marked brawler. Buzz Hyper gives him a thicker super reticle and instant damage upon snapping. Ash Hyper spawns a swarm of 10 rats that also deal knockback. Lola Hyper Ego does extra damage and can naturally regen HP. Fang Hyper does burn damage to all caught in Fang Super with big damage on that terminal opponent. Eve Hyper spawns double the hatchlings. Janet Hyper flies her into the air with greater speed and her dropped bombs cluster out like Squeak Super. Otis fires multiple sills and gains a speed buff himself. Sam's Hyper Gloves knockback and slow opponents. Buster Hyper gives a wider shield with a longer duration. Allies in his radius will be healed every tick like Jean's magic puffs. Mandy Hyper Super is wider and faster. RT's Hyper allows RT to launch himself over walls when going into ground form. Maisie Hyper has a more dramatic and more damaging explosion. Cordelius Hyper spawns a clonal minion in the Shadow Realm that copies Cord's firing, chasing and auto-aiming on the trapped opponent. Honestly, most of these are super OP. I hope Supercell has better ideas, because that was rough. But please, and I mean please, do not release Power 12 with this update. I pray to Zeus fucking Brock, please do not release Power 12. But yeah, otherwise I have faith in the dev team. See ya, bye bye.